I'm just going to introduce our lovely panel here. But first, before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Living Foundation project. Housing affordability in the HRM has become a major social issue. Every day we at the library see our customers come in the branches looking for assistance with housing resources and speaking to us about the difficulties and challenges of simply making ends meet. The Living Foundations project, funded in support from the Nova Scotia Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage, will explore issues surrounding housing affordability. The library's social response team, which is comprised of community specialists and community navigators, will be leading the project in partnership with United Way and Aaron Foster. Living Foundations will provide opportunities for community members to share ideas for making changes at the community level. So the library will commit to providing opportunities for community table talks like this one and workshops, and consider programming that will keep conversations going and that will hopefully lead to communities taking action. So this is one of those opportunities, so thank you all very much for coming. All right, so now I will introduce our panel. Okay, so I'll start with Dr. Jones. Is she not here yet? Okay. So Dr. Lynn Jones is running a bit late as she's coming from Truro, but I'll give her introduction just so she can smoothly slide in. So Dr. Jones is from the African Nova Scotian community of Truro. She is a community and labor activist who grew up in Truro and in her retirement actively engages in projects covering both Truro and Halifax, where she has resided for over 40 years. Dr. Jones became the first woman of color to be elected Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress, the largest union body in Canada. She presently chairs the first board of directors of the Down the Marsh Community Land Trust in Truro, whose purpose is to facilitate the obtaining of land to be owned in perpetuity by the Black community to erect affordable housing for members of the Black community. She has been awarded 2 honorary doctorate degrees by universities who have recognized her extensive contributions to social justice. So we'll look forward to hearing from her later. Next on our panel is Danielle Jackson. She is from the African Nova Scotian community of Beechville. Danielle Jackson Nay Wright is an 8th generation African Nova Scotian from the community of Beechville, one of the 50+ historical Black communities in Nova Scotia. She is a mother and grandmother. Working from the Afrocentric lens, she has been active in her community since she was a youth. Addressing anti-Blackness has been her passion since she was a young teen, and she has always utilized her platform to bring awareness, creating opportunities for authentic conversations and ongoing engagement. So thank you so much for coming. Thanks. Next we have Curtis Whiley. He is from Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust. Curtis Whiley is a 6th generation African Nova Scotian from the historical community of Upper Hammonds Plains. He has worked with the province of Nova Scotia in various roles with Housing Nova Scotia and the Land Titles Initiative. In 2020, he relocated to Nunavut, working with the Nunavut Housing Corporation to expand home ownership programs in Canada's north. Last year, he returned to Nova Scotia to lead delivery of the Land Titles Initiative. He's currently pursuing a Master of Business Administration with a specialization in social enterprise leadership from the University of Fredericton, and holds a Bachelor of Commerce from St. Mary's University. As a volunteer, he has been advocating for this community, which led to his founding of the Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust. This will create permanent affordable housing while providing land protection for the community. Through this work, he is engaging, educating, and empowering community and partnerships to recognize the benefit of community land trusts. So thank you so much. Okay, next is Kevin Hooper. He is a husband and father of 3 children. He is social development and partnerships manager with United Way Halifax and project manager for social enterprise with the Atlantic Home Building and Renovation Sector Council. He has a master's in urban planning and over 20 years experience working in various aspects of housing, including construction, management, housing supports, emergency shelters, policy, and advocacy. He is currently the project manager for a cross-sectional partnership exploring community land trust opportunities for Halifax. So thank you so much. And we also have Carolyn Wright, Thank you so much for stepping in. She's the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Capacity Building at the Halifax Partnership from the community of Beechville. And finally, I will introduce our facilitator. So this is Dr. Wayne Adams. He's our event facilitator. The Honourable Dr. Wayne Adams is a 50-year resident of East Preston. Dr. Adams is a well-regarded, award-winning former broadcast journalist, newspaper columnist, municipal and provincial politician, and environmental activist. Dr. Adams was elected the first member to the Provincial Legislative Assembly for the riding of Preston in 1993 and became the first African Nova Scotian elected to the Legislative Assembly and subsequently the first Black-appointed cabinet minister. He continues working on various projects and is now writing the closing chapters of his memoirs. So thank you so much to our panel for being here, and Dr. Adams, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, panelists and all. I want to commend the library, first of all, for doing more than books. When I grew up, there was hardly anything in a library but a librarian and a few books. And we've come a long way to be involved in community development and people development. And tonight's just one example. So congratulations to all those involved in the library movement and other facilitators or practitioners, I should say, like the United Way and community leaders. The topic of the value and the worth of land trust, and some of the panelists have been involved and have experience in that area. The first question of about 10 questions, and we'll have some more questions from members of the audience as the night goes along, as well as some from the live stream broadcast. I'm going to ask all the panelists, starting on my far right, I guess, Carol Ann. What is the land trust in your view?
So, with all due respect, I think Curtis Whiley would be the person to answer that. He's the specialist.
Well, he's the specialist at it. Okay,
Yeah, so
and
start with Curtis.
we'll yield with the one who knows.
Yeah, sure. I can give some background on that. So what a community land trust really is it's a community-led organization. And it typically holds land in perpetuity. And so community land trusts are community-based organizations, and I think that's the most important piece typically of them. They're made up of a tripartite board typically. That's 1/3 of community members at large, through 1/3 of members that are like living in the units, or the business owners that are on the community land trust property, and 1/3 is community stakeholders. It could be funders, it could be government officials, and so the board structure like this provides an equal kind of balance of power. And where the community gets to be really involved in what happens. And so that's essentially what it is. But they can take on, the thing that's really unique about community land trusts is that they can take many different forms, right? They can have many different kind of ideas and projects. For example, a community land trust may hold land in perpetuity, but it may, decide that it wants to divest property and make sure that its residents actually own their parcels of land. That isn't out of the question. It's what the community decides is the best, the best strategy for the trust. So I think when you picture community land trust, they're going to look different in each community because of essentially they adapt to that community's needs and that community's vision and that community's goals. So no two community land trusts are the same, right? Because no community's needs, visions, and wants are the same. But generally speaking, they hold land, and so in our communities, that there's a number of benefits to that, right? Because we know in our communities that often land is a sensitive topic because it has been taken from us through a number of different mechanisms since we got here, right? Since essentially the land issues began in the early 1800s. So since that time, we've been needing something that can protect our parcels, and so a community land trust can both protect and can leverage, right? Can leverage assets for community benefit. And Kevin can, of course, also add, Kevin is also an expert on this topic as well. If you have anything, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin. You want to expand on that or elaborate
Yeah,
somehow?
I think Curtis covered a lot of it. Curtis certainly got a little bit more history in this than I do, but I did want to pick up on the idea of holding those land assets in perpetuity, because that's often the kind of crucial mechanism that communities' interests are based upon. So, holding it in perpetuity, holding those land assets forever, gives community a certain kind of insurance over what's done with those assets. They're not going to be sold off to the private market at any point in the future. They are held and used for community purposes forever. Another thing that does, though, is by taking those assets out of the market, you're actually controlling inflationary pressures. So you're controlling those costs increase over time, which is why community land trusts are often used towards supporting affordable housing initiatives. You're just eliminating them as a kind of a market commodity, and you're making them a community asset.
Those are a lot of pros. Any cons to a community trust fund?
I guess it depends on your perspective. I think I found when I've been engaging in this topic, there's kind of an instinctive retraction from the idea of community-held assets. People, I think, in our society often think of property as private property. It's a commodity to be kind of held on to kind of increase your personal wealth and to use as leverage to kind of increase your status over time. So there's a bit of a compromise in that sense, But I think if you're looking at it from the point of view of long-term community benefits, frankly, from my point of view, there aren't many downsides. It really is about reframing the purpose of land and those assets. You're making them a community asset as opposed to a private asset. And from there, everything that a community land trust does is defined by the community. So, I think by and large, it's a really positive picture.
Where does the money come from to obtain the land?
Yeah, and so before I jump into that, I wanted to add too that there are certainly challenges to these. The number one is that we don't have a lot of examples, right? Here in our, it's especially in Nova Scotia, but more broadly in our country, community land trusts are a very popular mechanism in the South, right? And they're rooted in Black history. The first community land trust was developed by Black people in the South, Black sharecroppers. But we don't often, when I started learning a lot about community land trust, I didn't realize that it was actually a Black movement that created these, right? But of course, you can imagine my motivation when I'm uncovering that these are actually a part of our history, right? And it's a mechanism that we've used to collectively, move our communities forward. So there's challenges in that it's a model that is often speculative, right? So people that we see models of it, and sometimes those that are really working on it heavily can see how they can come to fruition, but often because we don't have examples, it's hard for people that aren't working directly in it to imagine what they would look like, right? Because there's not a lot of examples of them. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that, the community has to be on the same page, right? And so that's an important piece that takes time, but, and I don't know if we'll come back to this topic, but that's when, I've learned a lot from Beechville in terms of getting our communities on the same page, because you really need that galvanized, shared vision and understanding in order to really move these issues forward, and to realize like an actual, to get it set up and actually be moving toward that shared vision.
I wonder if Danielle could expand on her experience.
Yeah, he touched on about it's so important to have that community cohesiveness, because when you're planning, as we've alluded to, it's not really well known out there. So sometimes those who are not sitting around the table and I'm not talking about community, I'm talking about greater society, may be able to make it seem like it's not a good thing, because again, when we think about it, we always work from the collective, where we live in a society where it's really based on individual, right? So we see the benefit in the community trust because we are the collective, right? So in doing that, it's very important to, once you know the lands that you might be pulling into trust, to have that collective vision for the lands, so that you know what you hope to do with them. Because if you have the land trust without really a vision, it can cause further uncomfortableness.
Looking at the overall picture of Nova Scotia Black communities, the individuals live on the land they own for the most part. I don't know very many who have large masses of land. So how do you acquire enough land for industry or community development?
That's a great question. I think, there's, in our communities, yes, there's a number of parcels that are owned by individuals, but there's a lot of land that has interesting title in our communities. We have often crown lands in our communities. We have ungranted lands in our communities. We have owner unknown parcels. We have, what are historical parcels that are still in the names of, historical, the original settlers, quite frankly. And so we have all of these different types of parcels that are essentially locked in these title statuses without a real legal mechanism for us to gain title to them. We also have municipally owned parcels of land, and we have individuals, right? We have individuals that own property, and there are some folks that own a substantial amount of land in our communities. And what we're seeing, or at least the experience in Upper Hammonds Plains, has been that, developers are, they want that property. And so we're seeing a significant amount of development in our community as a result of a number of things, primarily the zoning in our community, which makes it very attractive for development. And so people are willing to sell their parcels of land because they haven't often been offered or afforded these types of figures before. So that's what motivated us to get somewhere. So it's not just about individuals, but for the Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust, it's about determining strategies for how to gain possession of a number of different types of parcels, because they exist in all of our communities, our African Nova Scotian communities. And even there's just quite literally no legal mechanism to gain title of some of them. Even with some of the government programs that are operating, these types of parcels would be outside of the scope of some of those programs.
So you're perhaps talking in terms of a co-op or a cooperative movement to collect people together to make a purchase on behalf of.
Yeah, well, I think that's far down the road for us. Quite honestly, I think where I think we're at is about identifying those municipally owned parcels and working with our municipalities in long-range planning to see how we can. And there's been a precedent set in Beechville in regard to that, and I'll let them expand on it because it's quite amazing, and it's setting a critical precedent for all of our communities that it's possible, right? And so even if we find, for example, a mechanism for us to gain title of parcels that have an owner unknown status, well, as soon as one of our communities is able to do that will set a precedent for all of our communities to take an inventory of those types of properties in our communities and follow the same kind of practice. And so that's essentially what we're focused on. What I'm focused on, or our community is focused on right now, as opposed to buying parcels from community members, because that does take a significant investment, right? We would have to have our organization significantly invested in to be able to make those types of transactions. But we have seen that type of investment happen in other parts of Canada, right? So we know it can happen, and we know it can certainly accelerate the growth and capacity of our organizations. So we're trying to strategize how that would work, but essentially it would be starting with these types of parcels like I mentioned, and showing that we can steward land and that we can build, that we can, do this thing, and then getting the investment and really accelerating what we're able to do.
How about the Community Investment Fund? Is that a help? The Community Economic Development Funds of Nova Scotia? CEDIF, yeah.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah.
No.
We haven't, so CEDIPs are an opportunity, but as Curtis is saying, the strategy is about how the community sees those collective properties and how the community can imagine building communities. It's not just about, particularly let me speak for on behalf of Beechville. The community has been able to expand its boundaries. The community, probably by next year, will be 6 times larger than it presently is. And the community has lost land over the years through taxes, people selling to developers, all those kind of things. The trust I see, and I'm really hopeful for the trust, Curtis' expertise inspires me along with the community work. So so the community has really rolled up its sleeves and done a lot of work on getting back surplus properties that belong to the community that were just expropriated. You wake up one morning and the property's gone. Those kind of things that happen, the evolution of land loss and land erosion in community. And so over the 5 years, the community has worked really hard to recover property within the community and also expand its boundaries to almost its original establishment. So
You've been successful in acquiring,
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah. So, and been able to effectively change policy in terms of how that's done. So when we talk about it, it's like, we've done that, so every community can do that. Like Curtis is saying, once we have an example of how that works, and it will work differently in every community. As I said, 6 times larger in terms of the circumference of community, but within community, identifying those lands that historically belong to communities, and having them transferred back in a reasonable time period. Because, we constantly talk to the city about, okay, what's the process of land transfers? And people say, well, we do 1 a year, but we're like, no, that's not gonna work. We're establishing them, and that has worked with intergenerational leadership in the communities as well. Because without the elders, and people even older than myself, who have been able to say, this is where we did this is where we did this was here. So all those things are really quite important. So in terms of land trust, that gives us a really hopeful vehicle for doing all this work and to be able to keep that land in perpetuity, as people were saying. That's the importance. Oh, somebody's phone. So that's why a land trust, I think, is the answer. And yes, they look different. Yes, it's difficult. There's a lot of legal pieces to this, but I think that we can create something that's very unique to Nova Scotia in terms of how land trusts are developed. So for Beechville, this is one thing that we've been looking at.
And can I just add one part to that? With the surplus lands, normally they'll tell you they can only transfer back 1 parcel at a time. But through what we were able to do was talk to them, and we will have ours all transferred at once collectively. So it's about how, I think that's been one of the biggest things for us is how we went into that conversation with members of municipal government, provincial and federal, how we met with them. And, oftentimes we hear about process and policies and all that. And we were very clear in our community where we understand process, we understand policies, we understand they weren't meant for us. Mm-hmm. So backing that part up and having the planners have to sit there and really build that relationship and the trust. And it didn't happen overnight. It took a little bit of time. Yeah. But the work that was done through there, they have actually, there were times where we didn't even have to speak. They were taking the questions and pushing them for us. So it showed how we can work together differently. So we always hear process.
You educate in the process.
Yeah, you gotta, right, question process and sometimes change process, throw it out the window and create one together collaboratively. And that's what we're doing, as Curtis said. We also look to Upper Hammonds Plains because they are the leaders when it comes to the community land trust. And so what we've learned is collaboration is where it's at. So while we're working over here on the community benefits action plan, then we got Upper Hammonds Plains over here working on another piece of work. And then when we sit together collectively, it makes it easier for all of us, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, right? And as we said, we know it's gonna look differently in every different community, as it should. But the framework will be there that hopefully makes it a little bit not as challenging, I guess.
Kevin, you wanted to get in there for a second?
Yeah, I think, it's a lot of good points, and Curtis made one about, I think, for any new initiative, there's going to be a certain kind of trajectory to development, right? Like, you're going to have to start relatively small, and you're going to build up, your potential, your assets over time. As that grows, your growth potential just increases, and the research we've done looking into other community land trusts across the country, they prove this. You kind of, first few years, you're collecting your assets, your options are limited, but you hit a point at which you've got the equity behind you in the organization to start going out and looking for opportunities that are going to benefit the community. And in that sense, I think the simplest way to think about a community land trust, in a way, is just, it's a nonprofit real estate development organization, right? That is oriented towards community interests. And I think, the most successful ones are really built in that way. Successful from the point of view of, being able to go out, acquire and preserve land holdings for community benefit. So again, I think that there's another good point is, just this idea that policies and processes have been developed for the privileged. And that kind of is a layered type reality. But one of those layers is, the privileged economic class. And in real estate, that is the wealthy developers, right? Like, they have dictated how that process works. And I think that there's a real opportunity with community land trust coming into the picture to start reframing that, right? Start redefining for the municipality, for the province, how that needs to work to be sure that investments in housing are going to benefit a community in the long term, not simply for, a short-term contract as we're seeing now. The province hands surplus land over to a private developer, and they sign a contract to operate that as affordable housing, for 15 years, and then they're just sitting on an incredibly, valuable asset. I think, this is part of the process. It's not just about creating new opportunities today. It's about redefining what this system of housing and land is really all about. Like, what are the values that we're trying to implement in this system?
Can't help, and I hear your explanations here, to wonder what effect Bill 222 or Bill 225 from the legislature would affect the pursuit of land trust development in our Black communities. Anybody?
We got all day. Oh, Miss Lynn's here.
Yes.
So, there's other folks who can speak more to this as well, but legislation around 222 and 225, I think, both of those things caused a reaction from me specifically because it sounded like old tapes playing. Like, here we are as we advance communities and we're working, and all of a sudden the reach, right, and so that reach becomes about housing, and we don't want to be in competition with housing versus the rights of Black communities, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we protect what we're doing and we protect the process in that, because we've seen far-reaching legislation being meant for one thing, and then our communities almost disappear because of the reach of provincial and municipal government as well. So this is the same thing that we're seeing when I say playing those tapes. Like, all of a sudden, this legislation and the reach of government are things that we have to mitigate, and a strategy with mitigation that has some teeth, not just us pushing back, but pushing back in a way to say we have the right to be able to develop our communities and not be restricted by new legislation.
It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, quite frankly. You get the first base, they change the base location.
Change the playbook in the middle.
So we do have a few questions online, and we will take some from the floor, but I'm going to give Ms. Lynn Jones an opportunity to speak as well.
I hope I get a minute, and I won't take it right at this moment, because I just want to tell you
Go ahead.
about Truro and what we're doing there, and to respond to your bill question. You want me to start with the bill? I'm sorry, I won't take up, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Because I think, first of all, those two bills, the chair might end up explaining to you, but just to make it really, really quick, and they definitely concern housing. They're about housing and how it changes in terms of how we as communities get to relate to housing. They were shoved at the last second. So don't be upset as a community that you don't know about them or you didn't get to respond to them, because basically it wasn't meant for us to be able to respond that quickly. On Bill 222, in terms of land trust and whatever, I was really concerned. The only way I knew about it, because we are talking to the Prestons, was because some of the friends that I had that are in the white community who had really direct access to what was going on had called me and said, Lynn, can you, like, we need someone from the black community at least to respond to this. Will you come and talk? So it was like minutes to go and actually appear. I did it online. And to blast them about how this would affect the community, in particular, that the hands of whatever happens in terms of housing and land would be in the hands of one person, one lone, which I said was likely to be a white, able-bodied male who knew nothing about our communities, who made all the decisions around what would happen in terms of land and housing. There were no other black respondents talking, and if to me the 222 is more serious even than 225, and we had nobody, well, I'm black, to speak to 222, except there was one other black sister from not CUPE, one of the unions, who was speaking on behalf of union members. So that was it on 222. 225, that will shove you pretty quickly, and thank goodness Angela got to speak after the original forum. So just on those two bills. I'm going to take just a quick minute to tell you about Truro and how we got to Community Land Trust. As you know, you're used to me from Halifax, but my home community is Truro. And I had spent a lot of time up there just since the pandemic. I have what I call, it's the homestead. I call it my cottage. Everybody else gets cottages. But it got turned around during the pandemic, so I actually spent, so then of course you get back in your community and you get involved and you look around, and next thing you know, you got that going, like once again, or as always. But one of the major areas in the community I come from, in the Marsh in Truro, which is traditional black community, for those of you know, of one of the three black communities, it breaks my heart, and I'm sure in the Preston area, your hearts are broken over what's happening in terms of housing. My heart was broken because in my little area, the Marsh, out of a whole black community, I mean, I grew up with, we had 4 ball teams just on the street, from the street. That's how many kids. There's so many. I come from a family of 10 kids. We were the smallest, one of the smallest families in the community. If you went there today, there's, what's that?
Hockey teams.
Hockey teams, well known for hockey. We didn't have to go to rinks or anything like that. Our whole community, we had to wait on the sidelines to play hockey because there were too many people. So just to give you an idea of what it was like. Now on the Marsh where I live, there's exactly 2 black families left, 2. The whole of the Marsh is gentrified. I say 2.5 because my cottage makes a half, because I live in Halifax as well as Truro. So there's 2.5 black families left in Truro, and of those 2.5 black families, there's no children. They're all seniors, and one has 2 older people. Can you imagine what it's like to go home now? Yeah. And the change in the community. It's affected every part of the community, even the church. At one time, I counted people in the church, and this, you know, because you know things from the basis of the church. And I remember going to church one day, and I was outnumbered in terms of the black people at church. And I'm like, what what has happened here? So having said that, in my community in Truro on the Marsh, fortunately, we had some family land, as well as from the time I was young, I was buying land. And it's cheap, you know, and the community got displaced because of, we had flooding issues there, poverty, different things. Most of the people own their own homes, then got turfed out of the community, couldn't afford to rebuild as their houses aged or got flooded. So the developers moved in real quick and started buying up the property, the homes cheap. First, they didn't move in, they just vacant land or rent your little house, the host, that house, whatever. There's another whole social issue, which I won't get into. I'm going fast, it's hard to go fast.
Take your time.
When you're passionate, because lots of those people that were in that community, they move in often to, for example, rental areas. We have social problems and ills that we never had when we were all together in our community. And we don't have that so much of what we had before, where the elders looked over the community. Or if you did certain things, there was someone there to respond to it, like, you know, your cousin, your aunt, auntie, whatever. But when you're all split up and gone, and there's somebody else that's the drummer, as they say, or calling the tune, that whole thing changes, and it relates all back to housing and the racism that you experience, all different types in those communities. Speed it up, Lynn, because coming from that is my original goal for my property. I had this whole idea that when I die, we all gotta go, like Faye said, then I'm gonna leave it to somebody. They're gonna take it, probably sell it or do whatever, put money in their pocket and away they go, right? And if that's the case, I can do that. I can do that myself. I can sell or I can do whatever, put money in my pocket and live happily ever after. Not for me, it's not happy, because it doesn't embrace what my community is, was, and can and shall be. So I first of all thought a reparations institute, because that's my key, and that I thought that would solve the problems, because all that's happened since the transatlantic slave trade, that if we really beefed up reparations, developed a whole institute, we got a university up there, we got property, we're in a traditional black community, perfect. So that's what I started pumping. I want a Canadian international institute on that property. So then it just happened, a group in Halifax, what's the name of the group, 902?
CLT 902.
CLT 902. That had been working in the area of housing and land trust, and I knew people on there. And this woman came to me, it's white, most of the group was white. Curtis is on it later, and then I think that's how it started. Oh, they came and said, could you come and talk about your Reparations Institute to our group? I said, yeah, sure, I'd love to. So I go, and I said, I'm not very far along. It's a concept, it's a vision, it's a dream. We'll go from there. So that's what I did. So go to talk to them, and they said, oh, gee, Lynn, this is fabulous. But it's too bad, because the government all of a sudden has this money, and they're interested now, which they've never been much, in nonprofit organization, community groups. And it's in the area of housing. So if you were doing something in housing, maybe there could be a fit here. And I looked at the woman, I said, you know, I'm really interested in housing and what it can do for the community. So literally a quick shift into, okay, we're gonna do housing. I still got that reparations in the picture. Let's see. So as we moved along, they basically said, wow, we've been at this 20 plus years. We're not there, we don't have any land, you've got land. I said, yeah, I'd love to have this land for the community. So they said, well, maybe we can help you. Maybe we can join forces, switch gears, and we'll help you. We'll support you to try to put this together. We literally had, I think it was, maybe 3.5 weeks. So it can be done. Literally I think it was 3.5 weeks to get a major proposal in and look at what we had happening, what we had in Truro. So we were able to do it literally within 3 weeks, working day and night, I'll tell you that, to put in a proposal to create a community land trust for the Black community in Truro. Hard work. We didn't know all the rules of the game. I won't go through those details. Come back, end up, to make a long story short, they come back and said, you're shortlisted. Okay, we're shortlisted. But if in this idea of shortlist, we need to know who's going to work with you, or who's going to do this project, who's going to be your consultant, who's going to do this and that. Thank the good Lord that employment, that's my baby, having worked in that area for a long time. So literally had a minute to get the consultants. So we got a community, later on, it was approved, we got a community development consultant that works with us. We have a lawyer, what's her title? Whatever, it doesn't matter. We have an admin person, missing a lot of holes in it, but it allowed us to go together. Then they said, but we can't give you the money. Can't give us money. No, you're not registered. Well, we just started, we can register, that's what the money should be for. No, before we do that, you gotta get registered. So we had to go find our own resources, hire a lawyer, do that fast, get registered. We did it, long process. Not that it should be, because it shouldn't. Got registered, come back. So again, long story short, we get funded. Okay, we're funded. But we have, where do we go from here? We have no framework, no building, no nothing. Don't know what we're doing. But I'll tell you, I wish I had bought the books. We got good books over community land trusts and particularly how they can operate. The framework, knew it was going to be different doing it on the marsh in Truro. Had to engage the community. So we set up what's called a transitional board, because basically it's a hand-picked board, if you want to be, for good reason, which you shouldn't have a board that's like that because it's community, right? And this transition has the initial funding to just put together the framework. So if you're doing this, don't be afraid, because it can be done. We have the resources. We put together from that transitional board, fabulous. We also have advisors. We set up advisors who could be from any communities, white, black, whatever, wherever, but resources that we need. We set up advisory, because some of them know some things that we haven't had a chance to do in our community. Did that. We just created another community development committee within the board. We have finance committee, whole bit. I won't get into all the logistics. Our funding ends at could be before March, but we are trying to stretch it to March, and then where do you go from there? We only got funding to start work out what are our values, who do we want. I'm telling you, it's a hard thing. Who's going to be eligible for our housing? Because we're trying to return some of those residents that grew up there in the community. So right now, and it's not passed, but it will be, some of the steps are like first choice, previous people from the marsh for low-income housing. That's the first, because they were there, that's who we want to give, and their descendants. Next choice. So there's a list of about 7 people. We don't want to leave out our African community, recent immigrants, but at the same time, African Nova Scotians need to be at the top of that list. All those are fitted in who we want to be in that housing. Income, what's affordable? You as a community can decide what is affordable. Am I talking too much?
No, you're doing well. Actually, you're covering ground that we want to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry.
From my perspective.
Okay. So it was, you tell me if I am. And I'm sorry, you guys.
That's okay. Take your time.
What's affordable? Holy jumping. What's the rate, you guys, right now in the government for affordable?
Don't think there's one.
Yeah, well,
Depends who you ask, which governments.
exactly.
Provincial, just say provincial.
Depends what community you're in.
Yep. What I'm trying to tell you is, what's their affordable? What's our black community affordable? Totally different.
Absolutely.
Totally and absolutely. So we had to go back and put in our framework. This is what we say affordable is. And this is how we need to set up our land trust so that our community fits into our definition. We call that part of our Afrocentric approach. I know on one of our committees, I got the word that was question around Afrocentrism and what our understanding is. And on our board meeting just a couple of days ago, I loved what they said. And basically what they said was, we're all learning. Sometimes they don't make it feel like only certain whatever knows what Afrocentrism is. We're going to develop it together. There's no hierarchy. There's no, you got the goods on Afrocentrism, but we just know that we want our communities and our land trust, our land, to be what we want it to be, and that's going to be Afrocentric, what we decide then. You like that, Nicole? Exactly what it is. So we do it from that perspective. We have, just before the land part, you think it was easy getting people to be on this project? It was just to be on the boards and on the, not because they're busy or anything like that. And this relates to intergenerational trauma and all the rest called, thank you so much, Ray. It was fair. We had beautiful jobs. You got to name your own salary and your own consultant fees, the whole bit. That's how we set it up. Nobody applied.
That's right.
When we start, nobody applied. And don't say we didn't put it out there. I know where to put job advertisements at. That's one thing I do know. It was everywhere. Nobody applied. I didn't have much time. So you literally had to go to people. You know how to do community development, community liaison person. You know the community. Why wouldn't you apply for that? Why do you think you can't do that job? So it went through that even that process was hard. Just getting people to realize that you can do it. And it's proven but there's another thing. Sometimes we don't have, and that happened on the Community Land Trust. Like at one point, for example, when we were hiring one of the positions, somebody said, well, they do that at St. Yvette's University, at the Cody Institute. So just go there, get somebody, and put them on. I said, no, not going to happen. Not that they can't do the job or that they're there. I said, we can hire somebody, an African person, a heritage person, and even if they don't know or have those particular skills or understand, they can hire someone from somewhere else to do that job. For example, they could hire somebody from Cody Institute to fill in the position.
Empowerment.
What's it called? Yeah. So no. So that's how we did it, so that when we bring in other people, which you need to, when you bring in other people, it's how we decide it, what have you. So for the land trust, we'll go back to that, and then I'll finish it off. What stage are we at now? Our community engagement sessions we have wonderful consultants, by the way, that work with us. Desiree Jones from Hammonds explains this one, and Natasha Gray from Truro is the other consultant, and then our admin person's from Truro. They have full-fledged circuit of meetings, community meetings. There's a big problem with that. I had said maybe I'm naive, I said, I don't think anybody's going to show. Like, do you really believe that you're going to say community land trust and people are going to show up at the meetings? I counted at one time for one day 7 different meetings in our little black community. 7 meetings that were coming in that people wanted to consult with our community about all at once. And then I was advised later, you think that's a lot? You haven't even got them all. So people aren't going to come out, like they're just bombarded with surveys and things and what have you. So we're gonna do just the call-out meeting, but we gotta do our kitchen table meeting, and we actually have a session to figure out different ways to engage people, because we know those big, just call the meeting. You guys are great here tonight, but we have differences. So we have all our community engagement sessions. We had hoped by March to have the new board, where the community elects the board and decides who they want, and we'll have all the framework and everything done for them before that time. I don't know if we'll make it for March, but that's the idea. And this very week, we are actually meeting, because we have the land that we have. We know other land that's really would go along with what we had that we want to buy. So therefore, we'll be seeking funds right away with that. Our problem is I have a great fear. There's fears, whatever. My fear right now is we did a lot of work in a short period of time. And we're really proud of what we're able to do for our community and hopefully get this thing on track. But you're dependent on what you have in terms of financing as you go along. I have a fear, but yeah, it has to work. It just has to. Is when March comes around and that first phase funding is finished, where's the money coming from to do the next stage? I think we can do it. It's a fabulous, the Community Land Trust, like people are saying, you think this is going to work, Lynn? Do you think it's the right vehicle? You think you'll be successful? And I said, we're already successful. That's right. Do I know if it's gonna be the be all and the end all? I most certainly do not. Like, I've been through a lot of different housing programs. I don't know. I'm willing to give it a shot and let us see what happens. If it doesn't work, we do something else. It's no big deal, but at least we try.
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Lynn. Hearing from Lynn and the Truro experience, the Beechville experience, the Upper Hammonds Plains experience. Any questions from the floor at this point? In terms, is there a value for a land trust society development in the Preston Township?
Dr. Adams, we have some from the Zoom. So this came from online. How does the old HPC fire hall being sold back factor in? Is that an example of how Beechville had land transferred back, or is it different?
That's Upper Hammonds.
Yeah, so in Upper Hammonds Plains, we founded the first all-black volunteer fire department in Canada, in North America. And so that essentially the history behind it in terms of our relationship with the municipality on that was that they'd stopped funding it. And so the building became vacant and derelict, for lack of a better, I guess, term. And so they offered for the community to, well, I believe it took a lot of advocacy, for the community to be able to purchase back the fire hall. So that's what happened. And so an initiative that's being led by the Upper Hammonds Plains Community Development Association is to rehabilitate that center into the Elizabeth Mantley Hall. And so there's been a very dedicated fundraising effort to seeing that project through to completion. So the rehabilitation of that center is happening. The community owns that property and that structure, and is fundraising significantly to recognize or realize a new facility for our communities, for our youth in particular.
And one last question from online, and then we'll get to questions in here. You've spoken a little bit about the Bill 225 and Bill 222, but the question was, what were panelists' individual reactions to the Bill 225 amendment? Does it go far enough? And they put the amendment in there, which I can read. It's where a bylaw or part of a bylaw exclusively impacts marginalized communities, including African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq communities, the minister shall conduct consultations with representatives of the impacted communities to ensure the protection of the communities before making an oath under subsection 1 respecting that bylaw or part of a bylaw. So I guess they wanted to know if this amendment is does it go far enough?
Sure. You know what? I have, I will share. So, you know, the introduction of the bill is complex for me, right? I'm a public servant. I have been for 10 years. And so we are dedicated. Of course, the introduction of the bill didn't come from my, my office. And so when I first read Bill 225, I certainly was concerned as a community advocate, right? Because our community has been working for 2 years to amend our zoning, right? So that we can protect, or at least, be involved in some of the development that's happening in our community. So from my understanding, the bill would have essentially would give the authority for the province to perhaps nullify those changes that we've worked really, really hard to get. And so that was certainly concerning for me, right? And so that's how I felt about Bill 225, respecting the amendment. Do I feel like it's strong enough? There's it's complicated, but there definitely could be stronger language. I think the word exclusively affecting African Nova Scotians communities is complicated because, there's not bylaws or laws often that exclusively affect our communities, but they certainly disproportionately affect our communities, right? And so that's a big one. So yes, I do believe that I was concerned, personally speaking. Bill 222, concerned. So I hope that our communities can be involved in consulting, in large C consulting on that piece of legislation, because it certainly would have a significant impact. And just in terms of land titles, when those bills were introduced, that caused people to be very concerned in community about land titles, and so that's a personally very important topic for me, because we've worked for a very long time, right, to build some level of trust and understanding with the communities that we serve through the Land Titles Initiative, right? And it's a battle, some of our cases are very complex, right? And people have been working on them for a very long time, years, right? And that's a fact. And so when we hear, the potential that some of that could be shooken up, or that people could be losing something, of course people are upset. But it's especially challenging for me as somebody who's trying to fix those issues in our community, and they're complex, very complex. So I think, those bills, yes, I hope that we certainly do receive some, or that we are involved in more of their consultation, Big C consultation on those.
Very concerned indeed, because when one level of government gives another level of government empowerment over land use, we know the history of Beechville.
Yeah. The other thing that...
Don't have to say any more on that one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But the issue of consultation we have to take seriously. So when government says, or anybody says, consult, it's just a consultation. You don't have to abide by the consultation. It's just a consultation. So my concern was a couple of things. You have the Office of African Nova Scotia Affairs there. And the fact that it didn't even go through there, or that office wasn't consulted, was an issue for me in terms of the whole consultation period. And if you're consulting, then the mechanism for the African Nova Scotian community is ANSA, right? To go back and make sure that those consultations, what comes back for EXA, it should have started and ended with it. So because it does not really provide a mechanism for consultation, that gives me some cause, gives me pause, right, for that. And as Curtis was saying, the exclusivity thing, which means the onus is on us to then prove how it would impact the community. So that's another thing on us that we would have to ensure, right, in terms of, the impact and all of those kind of things. So, there's a couple of things in terms of, government's responsibility to consult, making sure that the consultation is authentic and that it matters at the end of the day.
And just on that, you guys kind of both hit the points I was going to talk about, which was really the power and privilege of language, right? When we talk about even the words and stuff, like the language that we don't put things in plain language, so you lose folks, right? So people aren't able to really decipher through what is being said, right? So there's that part of it, and also the soul tax, as Carol Ann said, it puts the onus back on the community to once again do the constant labor and taxing that we do, and most times it's done on a volunteer basis. We all have full-time jobs that we do this because of, we've been brought up as freedom fighters all through, like it's in our blood, right? So we do it because it's necessary. Our ancestors went through stuff we can't even imagine, but we got the next generations behind us coming, so I think that we need to be mindful. And again, my question always is, who's at the decision-making table, right? And if you're at the table, did you get a menu? Do you got a plate? Do you got a fork? We need to be in a situation where we are not only sitting at the table, we're developing what's on the menu.
Participating.
Kevin, do you want to contribute to that? I know that you're representing United Way. In support of a community land trust, how do you guys support? How do you offer support?
Sorry, how do we offer support through a community land trust or with the project that we're?
The project that you're working on.
So I guess just a general framing, we are pursuing a project to explore community land trust opportunities for Halifax at large and the various communities within it. Just trying to get a sense of how can you adapt that model to the needs of the various communities of Halifax. And I think, fundamentally, we've done a lot of research, and we certainly have had a lot of conversations with government decision makers to kind of try and get a sense of where they're coming from on this. Dr. Jones made a point about government pushing money out to develop nonprofits and build capacity in the community right now, and that's happening for a reason, because government is kind of pulling back from some of their traditional responsibilities to things like public housing, investments, where they're building and managing housing. They've pulled away from that, I think, with an expectation that the private developers would kind of fill the gap, this idea of supply and demand. If there's a demand for housing, the private sector will come in and fill it, but it hasn't happened. So there's this gap right now in who's taking responsibility for this, right? And so for us, I think where we're seeing the value of a community land trust is we need to establish a housing developer and manager that is serving the interests of community, not serving the interests of shareholders and profits and that type of thing, right? So we're trying to build a concept which can lend capacity to any organization, Upper Hammonds, Plains, Beechville, Preston, that can kind of work together to build capacity, to kind of leverage the strength of the whole in order to kind of realize each community's, goals and aspirations. So at this stage, it's still, we're thinking through how to kind of, structure this thing. But certainly willing to kind of share any of the research we've done, any of the knowledge we have, any of the advocacy kind of routes that we've developed. So at this stage, it really is just actually looking for those opportunities to share and collaborate.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? Or anything to be cleared? Or yes?
You stated earlier that there are no LTI initiatives across the country, right? Yet, there are, it hasn't really been tested and tried across the country, correct?
Sorry, community land trust model?
Yeah.
Yep, it's certainly been in operation in British Columbia for 30 years or so. There's a decently established one in Calgary, a new one in Parkdale, Toronto, Hamilton. There's a number around, but I will say the history in Canada is much shorter than it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. But, I would say I always point to the one in British Columbia. It's probably the longest standing one in Canada. And, they've been around for 30 years, and I think they operate, I don't know, what is it now, 12,000 units? And they're building hundreds of units a year at this stage. So that's kind of speaking to what I was saying before, they started slow, but when we talk to their executive director now, he says, you know, they've just hit this point where they have enough in the bank to just go out and compete with private developers and go grab the opportunities they want and kind of turn them into assets for community. That's their business now, and they're doing it every day and growing every year.
So how was that initiative funded? In British Columbia, the one that you said that's been around for
Do you know
30
the details,
years.
Curtis? I don't want to hog the mic here, but.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I can tell you that that organization started with only a couple, well, I think with one co-op, which was essentially a number of different buildings. I think they were actually apartment buildings, but it was part of a co-op. And so they operated that for a while, right? And so they kind of proved that they had this kind of, that they could steward this property. They could property manage this, and they could be successful doing it. And so I think they started to grow a bit, but it wasn't until they did receive a $2.5 million investment from the municipal government, right? I believe. And so I know it was that amount of money. I just don't know which. Yeah, it was from Van City. And that really accelerated them and propelled them to be able to get, acquire other properties. And when we see, like, for example, Kevin mentioned Parkdale. Parkdale started as they owned one building, right? And so they stewarded that. The city of Toronto, saw that they were able to do this and conveyed them 80 properties, right? So it's you see this kind of model where it starts off. That's why I know that once one of our communities just has something in our own possession in terms of housing. I mean, some communities have land. My community does own land as well, communal lands, as well as like a rec center. So different things like that. But it's really, showing, I guess, that you can steward, develop, or property manage housing. And then, then you really have an argument for stewarding perhaps provincially owned, housing that exists in our communities, some of our communities, but also, being able to be in a position to receive an investment so that you can actually do development yourself.
Just to go back again to the point about government investments right now, I think from my read and from those I've talked to, government at both the municipal and the provincial level are pretty enthusiastic about community land trusts. Like, they see a lot of potential in it as a type of a model, an organization that can fill that gap of development. I think it's important to note, right? I don't know that they're entirely interested in community land trusts for all of the community support benefits that come along with it. They're really interested in it as a way to get affordable housing built, right? That is the vehicle by which affordable housing is going to get built. And I think as long as a community land trust puts itself in the position to do that successfully, like Curtis said, set yourself up with a good business plan, with a good business model, with professional staff who know what they're doing, right? Like, developing property is not a weekend pastime. It's a complicated business. But as long as you set yourself up to give government confidence, I think there very likely could be investments in community land trusts to make these things happen. I think that's the future they see ahead right now.
And I'd just like to say I'm glad Kevin brought up those points, because I think he's absolutely correct. And that's how we jumped in to the process, was because all of a sudden they're interested. For sure, the provincial government was interested in how nonprofit housing could fill the gap. So even though they'd been talking, for example, land trust for eons and couldn't get anywhere, all of a sudden there's an opening to actually make it happen. But it directly relates to Bill 222, which I think is the more critical bill than the 225, because under 222, you can work directly with, like what we're doing right now, with Nova Scotia Housing, who there's local people in there, they're interested. We have a good partnership to try to make this new way of doing things work. 222 comes along, they wipe it out. You no longer can work directly with that, like Nova Scotia, for example, housing. And this one person at the top of the hierarchy, the commissioner now, controls everything, knows nothing about you, not working with you. But that's the person,
a government power grab.
one lone person who
That's what
will
it is.
decide what happens in that. That's why I think that really more of the eggs need to go into that first bill. Keep in mind, we did not have one representative talk. Yes, they did. They had me to that talk to that bill. So thank you, Kevin, because I think you're absolutely right, and we can't go backwards.
Yeah, that bill is a threat. It's a power grab by government, quite frankly, yeah.
Can you explain 222, please?
Don't ask me. Don't ask me. But that's a good. That was a TV show.
227. 227. Okay, we have a question in the back.
I'd like to direct a question to Brother Wayne. Since you've already have experience in government, is there some way that the public, the Black community, the African Canadian community here, could put some kind of go after some kind of way after government outside of what is being said, some kind of class action suit or something, just to get yourself heard and get a chance to speak to them at the table? You hear what I'm saying? Is there any provision for that in government?
As a facilitator, I'll try to answer. I think in my time in government, we entered the idea of roundtables of the public at large to meet with ministers on various topics. Like I did the Environment Act, and I surrounded myself with business people who had some idea about recycling, management, raising money, and the rest is history. That model has been scrapped by the second government that followed us. They don't want to hear from you, quite frankly, because you may know a little more than what the inside guys do. And they really want to hold on to the idea of power. We've seen it right now in the past month with the House, with all the crown corporations being shut down, the power going to the minister. That's all I'll say on that for now.
Question to you, Lynn.
But to go back and answer your question, yes, there's a way.
There is a way.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you start with your MLA in your various areas.
Right.
And insist on that opportunity to talk.
Okay. Lynn, are you making any inroads with the youth in Truro concerning this matter thus far?
That's an absolute excellent question, and we just were given statistics and on what the demographics are in our Black community. Just to keep this all in perspective, I think it was 48% of our community are elders, 48%. And if you go to the end of the youth, the numbers are so small. For example, on the marsh, before everybody was completely gone, we had no children, period. And now there's children which come to my house regularly, and of those on the street, there's no Black children on the street. But anyway, in terms of youth, what we did was, to start with, was we have youth as a part of our board. And it's really good because they're also a member of the finance committee. But we want to have a complete picture, a picture over how the youth want to participate until November the 26th is when we have our forum. And we will also be gathering the youth perspective, what youth we do have in terms of how they're involved. They're not, we don't have we're not using the capacity that could be used. I have to say this in a good way, I gotta live there. But we do want to get more youth involved, if that answers it. Thank you.
Can I just jump in on that idea of age, which I think is really significant to this community land trust conversation, where Lynn had said before, community land trusts have been around for a long time, and people have talked about them for years, and it really hasn't ever gotten any traction. It's getting traction now for a number of reasons, but I think one of them is demographics. You know, we've got a baby boomer generation that's kind of into retirement and getting to the point of, you know, end of life estate planning. So on one hand, you've got a generation that's holding the vast majority of private land assets and wondering, what am I doing with these at the end of my life? On the other side of the scale, you've got a youth generation coming into adulthood who really, I think for the first time in this country's history as a whole, are looking at the prospects of home ownership and even just affordable rental, and they're just not seeing any opportunities whatsoever. You know, so all of a sudden, I think people are waking up to the fact that there needs to be a different way of going about, you know, housing, than, you know, different than what we've done over the last 5 generations. You know, like, I think it's just all of a sudden dawning on people, we're in a very different situation now than we have been for a long time, and the system needs to adapt, and this is one of those adaptations.
I also think it's important that even when talking about the land trust planning for community, that we make space to give the youth voice, even if it's 1 or 2 of them, bring them to the table and have them, we said in our Beechville, we've always had the mantra, whether you're 2 or 92, there's a role for you to do, right? And we did, and through the pandemic, we had our youth delivering food packages to the older folks, little things like that. It may not be having that big conversation, but it's still building community pride, right? And then they're invested. You do it in little ways. We have like the youth development initiative, so that's specific for the youth. But then we also, in the summertime, make sure and have like their summer programs, things like that, that might not be talking land trust, but they're talking about community pride, knowing your heritage. And once they do that, it kind of, you can see them brighten up, because they're also contributing. So I just want to.
Hi. I have a question mostly for Dr. Jones, I believe. So we're talking about, I know we're talking or focusing on the Preston area, but I thought it was really interesting how you talked about Truro and how where you're from, Black people are no longer the majority. So when you're looking at community land trusts, how do you make sure that the history of the land is considered when they're not living there now? Like, how do you bring that to the forefront?
Wow, thank you so much for that question, because I'll just start with one thing. The name of our trust is called Down the Marsh. The reason for the name, where the name came from, is there's 3 areas in Truro, Black communities: the island, the marsh, and the hill. And I know in other communities they do the same thing. There's a place where the up goes and a place where the down goes. So you go up the hill, you go up the island, but you go down the marsh. So that was our first step at preserving our historical community. And the other thing is that we built that into our Afrocentric model. That's the key, the history. For example, part of the land, a big piece of the land that we will be utilizing belonged to my grandfather, Jeremiah Jones. Jeremiah Jones was a hero during the First World War, who captured a German machine gun. That's we're really proud of that. But he's actually in school textbooks and what have you that's starting. So what we envision, we also have a donation, semi-donation of, you know, those concrete bus things that you do of the community. So there's also a vision of that history being on the land, like at very points, major family history. We also want to go back to, we're doing other areas of the community to get that history out there and we're taking over the street, even though it's not even many black people there right now. If you talk to the kids that are there now, that they have all been around where I am, they can tell you that they're from the marsh. Like, you know, even though they're from the marsh, they're living on the marsh. And they also, there's benches there that have already history that we had on family property. They know the story. So there's this concept. At the top of the street, there's an organization called the Nova Scotia Women's Historical Society. They were the Halifax Historical Society. Great group. They are the group that put those monuments down on the waterfront, right? You know, from the explosion? And there's one black model who is Wanda Lewis's mother. What's her name? You know, Gordon.
Margaret Gordon.
Margaret Gordon, that's it. One of those figurines, because they wanted to make sure African people were part of the history, which they haven't been in terms of women on the waterfront. So you'll see that statue there. That same group is at the top of the street through the town, but it will be done because they changed, they're now the Nova Scotia group. There is a black education whole area at the top as you come into the marsh that will celebrate black educators. It's almost going to be historical when the land trust gets in, and they will be celebrating 4 black educators with painting, pictures, bilingual, the whole bit, to try to make that history through that whole area. I will say one of the houses, I'm getting in trouble again, I'm used to that we tried to save the black house, the last house of the original community, but we weren't able to do that. The house is fortunately still there, so maybe we can try another tactic. But yeah, it's important to preserve that history. There was a traditional African Methodist church, which people don't know about, we didn't know, that was not far from the Truro community, and those people, many of them, ended up, when the community split up outside Truro, they came into Truro, so some of the families, like Tynes, some of the Joneses and what have you, came to that long lost, forgotten, which we've got archaeologists now looking into protecting that property and making that heritage. So that's the kind of thing you wanted to know about? Yeah, thank you.
Question?
Just a question regarding the Beechville Township in regards to it growing exponentially, I believe 5 or 6 times larger than it was. And this might apply to Truro as well, but as the process went on and the land was granted, were there elders or other family members who thought that, did you have to negotiate with them, or does it just automatically go to the project, rather than, were there citizens there that saying, well, this belonged to my family?
So we went with the HRM plan, that like dedicated planners came out, and we had a multi-generational approach. So when we did walks through the community. So what they did is the planners would come out with, sometimes it would be a handful of folks, sometimes it'd be a lot more folks, to actually help and identify parcels of land that they remembered. And actually we were able to find walls that still stood while we went through. So those lands were all really the surplus land, so we really didn't have like the people having to relocate their own individual lands. They were all the surplus land, so it wasn't any like older folks having to change lands, I guess.
So you didn't have to settle with anybody?
No, they were all surplus lands.
Interesting question though. So as we expanded and talked about the boundaries, Spryfield, community of Spryfield abuts the extension. So as we go to our new boundaries, we had some concerns from Spryfield. But we know that there were Beechville foundations that they even found from their historical society that we didn't know about. So, so relying on anecdotal information from grandparents and family, and you do the research, is they were absolutely correct in terms of where the community went. So it went, part of Beechville is in Spryfield. And there was a historical society that actually said, Not concerned about they were concerned about the boundaries because their historical society, I think their building or something is next to our new boundaries. And we're like, we're cool with that, but we're still taking the boundaries. We're still going to extend there because that's where they were. Those things were critical in terms of, as Danielle said, the intergenerational knowledge of our ancestors and our living elders is critical in this, right? It's critical because they were able to say yes, no, or we don't know, and so the other piece of the property going into Bayers Lake now, that new development, there were foundations in there as well, right? So, just to say that all this is, we're learning as we go by having the experience of elders, and that does something for youth participation in this. They see some hope in this process, and for me, that is really important. And because they're the ones that are going to have to carry this. So seeing them go, really, you're making, those things are happening, you're not just talking about it, we're making those moves. So yeah, the youth piece to that is critical, as critical as the elders.
And I think that was demonstrated when we had our industrial park finally rightfully named to Beechville Industrial Park. When that sign went up, we marched down, we took over the streets. We marched from the industrial park down to the church, and we had the youth were leading. Carol Ann's got some really good footage of that it just makes your heart just like, yeah, it just was, you could feel it. And we went to the lands that Carol Ann said where actually there was, it was also, we had what's his name? Fowler, yes, where they discovered an actual pipe that predated the abolitionist movement in the States.
And sorry, because we got to get this out, right? So we know there's questions. So the abolitionist pipe was really a turning point for us as well. So finding that pipe, it had abolitionist slogans on it, right? And it's the Bible, nothing but the Bible is an abolitionist slogan. And they went back and talked about that era. What's interesting is Richard Preston was the first minister of the church, Beechville Church as well, and he was an abolitionist. So I got goosebumps when making those connections because it showed that we were descendants of freedom fighters, in the foundation that they excavated. There were 5,000 pieces of, it's in the Museum of Natural History, about 5,000 artifacts, right? So you can go see them. I don't know if they're still up, but just the power in knowing that was in the community and that pipe was in there, connected us historically, not just in a history book, but actual artifacts that proved our connection. So I know we went a long way around your question, but it's important to share with communities because I really think that all communities need to have an archaeologist study. Yes. Can you imagine going to Birchtown and doing that? Imagine going to the Prestons and having those kind of studies.
Wow.
Those connections are absolutely important, and that we do that. And that we stay connected on the land trust piece, because we can't do this as individuals. We're up here as 3 communities talking about this because we need there to be alignment around how we do this work and to stay really solid in the pocket around the need to protect community lands. We know what's happened historically. We don't want that to happen again.
You have 2 more questions on the floor?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so we've talked a lot about sort of the idea of them, of the land trusts and I guess the value of them, but what I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is the management of them and how do you put together a structure in your community to do this, to start this? That's the part that I don't fully understand.
I think your question's critical, and it's an area where if you looked at what we were doing, at first you would say, boy, you guys are going some slow. We actually were really fortunate on our board to have a person who, that's what they do professionally, is work with community groups in developing their structures and their values, and that was a slow process. We could take one word of how you thought something should work, and it could take meetings to come to a consensus on if that was the correct word, even just in the defining the purpose to begin with. That it's one sentence, I think, our purpose. I don't know it offhand. That one sentence took forever to come to a consensus about this is who we are. But in terms of, I want to tell you something really important. In terms of what was the question about us?
I'm actually thinking about it even earlier than that. I'm thinking about how do you get people invested in this idea, and how do you find the right people in your community to connect with, to work with, to get this done the right and proper way.
Well, if you remember from our perspective, when we started, we literally had, 4 weeks? 4 weeks to put it together. And so how we were able to do it was with the help of, remember I said that other groups, that CLT 902, who had been working a lot with that, and that's how that was so great for them to be supporting us, was we literally sat down and said, okay, what does it look like? So they were able to supply a lot of the information, and we don't know, we never worked with, we don't know what it is, you know? But so they were able to provide a lot of the vision that helped us say, and then we had to say, okay, to get this thing started, to set it up, we now knew what we needed, the minimum people or consult, whatever, to make it work. Once we figured that out, remember I said, it was employment, to go out and do the job description that you thought could do the job, and then put that up. So that had to be done within those 4 weeks. We're doing all of this. That we did it. Thank goodness I provide the lead in that area because I have such an employment background and those kinds of things. So we were able to put that in. I don't think that because we are transitional, I wouldn't want you to think that is something really difficult or that can't be done quickly, because we did it quickly. The key will be in the long term. So these things take time. Sustainability. So the next will be getting that permanent group of people that are determined by the community and all of that. And the community will do that. You don't decide that. No. The community will tell you what it is that they want, and that's who it's going to be, that it works that way. So don't think that upfront part can't be done. But, yeah.
It's probably obvious, but, you know, I'm not sure that once you get into the work, it stays that way very long. There's a lot of complications and details to this model. I always find like we're always taking a step back and thinking about what are we actually trying to solve with this, right? Like, I think that the starting point is really being clear about the issues you're trying to address. And then the kind of definition, you know, the character of the community land trust you'll develop comes out of that, right? Again, like Curtis said at the start, it can look all sorts of different ways. And a lot of that really just depends on who your community is and what you're trying to achieve with it, right? So to me, that's the starting point. You really need to rally people around that common sense of like, what are we trying to do here? And then the details kind of fall out of that understanding.
Go ahead.
And from our perspective, I see Anthony, I got you next. From our perspective, in the not the buy-in, but making it relevant for community. So simply engaging, like getting people to come out through engagement, so it's not always that tough work. Like, so celebrations in community, things like that, those are all opportunity to provide information and engage with people who might not normally come out. So that's another way to spark people's interest. We also have somebody from our community who's very well versed in like board development, strategic planning. So we had planning sessions, multiple ones we're planning for a new one coming up, but also having community help you develop or identify like asset mapping in the community. So everybody, we all have a voice, right? And if we take the time to engage and make everybody feel part of, everybody's not gonna always be on a 10, but even if they'll support different initiatives, and it is, it's not easy, and oftentimes you do find it's that small nucleus of people that do a lot of the work, but the community will show up and show out. It's a lot of times our communities have historically been ramped up to go, and then things fall by the wayside. So, and that's no doing from the community, that's from other folks. So a lot of people have the mindset of show me something, right? So if we're showing community, like through, it can be as simple as engagement or having a community barbecue, right? So folks will come out for that, and then you have different booths or different, like we've brought artifacts out to the community, right? So that was a very good opportunity. People want to come out and see the artifacts that were discovered. So then you have the information available that speaks to what the next pieces of the movement are. Do you want your voice heard? How can you contribute? Like things of that nature.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I agree with what everybody has said here. There have been times when I think you have to be prepared that there are going to be times there's going to be a small nucleus. There's going to be times when you get to present to a room full of people like this, right? And people are interested. Those are all just parts of the journey. I think, and we come together around necessity. In Upper Hammonds Plains, we came together because we had to, right? We had to do something. There are times when there's a ton of motivation, and there's times when we are tired, right? And so that happens. So people show up when they can. But we really do forge ourselves forward in a number of different ways. We were able to engage, and I think there's different things that happen. We had a good solid plan, or what we thought was a good solid plan. And then you realize that, actually you need to go on a whole journey of reconciliation with Halifax Water before you can even do what you thought you were going to do. Or, and then so a bunch of people want to get involved in that in the community because they're really passionate about. So, you end up engaging a certain group of people in that regard. And then you have something else going on. Now you want to, get more funding. You're telling the community kind of what you're doing next, and then those folks join. So it's not just all going to be, every time we're waiting for those 15 people to show up or 5 people to show up. It's always going to look different, depending on how people, are feeling and where you're at in the community, how much, transformation is on the table. I will say too, to your point about management and professional skills, it wasn't until I started this work that I realized how much capacity building we have to do and how critical it is for us to do this inside of our communities. We had a vision in Upper Hammonds Plains of doing this FUBU, for us, by us. But as we started down this journey of needing planners, economists, architects, and really trying our best to find these professionals, finding that it's very difficult to find those folks that look like us, and if they do, they're at capacity, right? Or you don't have the funding to be able to pay them what they're worth, right? So there's so much capacity building, and I think that's the biggest thing as our communities form these community land trusts. Yes, it's about building housing, but really when your community starts coming together to talk about the land use planning, and because they're not planning, our communities aren't being planned like some other areas, right? And that's why, the way that they grow is not the same. And the way that they look is not the same. And the way that they're planned is not the same. So when our communities start to get together and talk about how we want to plan our communities and what our real vision is for the future of our communities, it's powerful, right? And that's what brings people to the table. So I wanted to leave you with that.
Okay, I really like the analogies. I like how Truro has come on board and Beechville has done their thing. But in the last 10 minutes, I guess you guys have been furthering along saying, okay, these people have reached out and helped and so on and so forth. And that's what I was going to ask a few minutes ago. So we've kind of gone in that area anyways. But another question I had is, you were talking about a surplus of land. What is actually surplus of land? Is that Crown land? Is that Nova Scotia government land, or?
It could be all the above.
Yeah.
Surplus land is, sorry, my voice is very low. So surplus land is land that whatever the municipality or the province decides they no longer need. And what the historical process was, particularly for Beechville, I'll stay in that lane, was that when surplus land arose in the community, they put it out for anybody to be able to either purchase or use, et cetera. But, so Beechville has set a precedent in that any surplus land that comes up in Beechville, community has first right of refusal. So we're not refusing any land that they put up for surplus. So that helps build our assets in terms of land. But surplus land is like, it comes up in the paper, I think, sometimes. Because we've been so involved, we now get a call. The surplus land available in some part of the community, and we'll get the call. But otherwise, it goes out to anybody else who might want it, and that's where developers get
living
opportunity for cheap land.
sorry,
Go ahead.
living in Lake Loon, Cherry Brook, there's a lot of land that's nobody's living on. That, in my mind, is surplus, but it's crown or province land, that type of thing. So how does that work for us? It might work for you guys that way, but how's that going to work for us? How do we get to that position?
I should clarify too that, provincial, like I mentioned before, there's a number of different types of title. HRM surplus lands are some of the, what we're discovering is some of the ones that we are able to perhaps negotiate the quickest based on the precedent that's been set in Beechville. For example, like we have HRM land, but it's deemed as HRM parks, right? So in order for us we have to actually do a process to convert that parcel to HRM surplus before it could ever be conveyed to the community, right? So that's just one type of title holding, and those are lands that are owned by the municipality, right? But if you're talking about crown land or ungranted lands, those are owner unknown parcels. Those all have different titles, different administrations, different departments that administer them, and different pieces of legislation that you would need to work through to do that, right? Yeah,
Sorry.
essentially.
I just wanted to add that all of this is predicated on a strong community plan. I have to say this.
Right.
If you don't have a community plan, this will become burdensome.
Yeah.
So for us, what worked is the community got together, did their own plan, and then called folks to the table. Here's what we need to happen. Here's what our vision for our own community future is, and the lands and then in your community, begin to ask the question. We want to know the status of this property. We want to know the status of that property, and that's what we did. We began to go through and ask for the status. And as Curtis said, having that, they're all different, but you have to be able to have your plan first, so people know that you have a plan and you're not playing. It makes a difference.
Okay, I understand that because I've been following this whole meeting tonight to the fact that different Truro and Beechville have grown, and Hammonds Plains have grown in different aspects, whatever. So I'm envisioning in my mind 2 years, let's just say 2 years from now, all of a sudden, Cherry Brook and Lake Loon's got together, North Preston, East Preston's got together, and they get the same people in the pieces together. Okay, we're ready to attack, get some lands back. Right. Then where will we go from there? So I guess it falls back on what Curtis was saying again. So I think we can get to that point because that's what this meeting's about today, right? That the Prestons come back together, right? So I think we can get that point, but maybe along the way we just need somebody maybe to walk along with us a little bit, that's all. All right, I'm going to leave it at
You
that.
can call Beechville anytime.
Yeah. Most definitely, and I'll close by by just quickly saying that, to your point, if you can really picture all of our communities owning as much property as we possibly can, and having a coalition, right, of land trusts across our province, we would be some of the largest landowners in this province, right? There'd be a significant amount of leverage, that would come along with that, socially, fiscally, politically, and of course, if we have the ability to quite well band together and come together, especially I think when business is involved, right? It's something that's exciting to actually build things and dream them and actually, make them happen and house our own people would be extremely powerful. So that's kind of what the vision would look like in the future in this space.
I guess it's my turn to speak now? Okay.
Could I just respond on, thank you, Roger, just.
Well, you know I'm not going to stop you. You can say whatever you'd like to say. If the facilitator isn't saying anything.
Mr. Whiley, just on that note, this is not exactly the answer to your question, but it's one thing that we did on a really initial stage, because sometimes in our communities, there is, it's not, I don't like to even say it's the crabs in the barrel kind of syndrome, but we use I don't know if you've ever seen this video, X and Y. It's a wonderful video if ever you can get it. But anyway, it's a case of where there's not many openings, or for us, it's a reality. Like, there's this little spot for black people, they'll give black people this much money here. And if another black group is doing the same thing and tries to go up, there's no spot left for them to get the money. So instead of hitting the top and getting mad at the top for saying, you realize that that's not the problem at the top. There should be more spaces here. We got to stop fighting among ourselves for this one spot that's up there. We need to create more spots. So how, from our perspective, when we started, we made a decision, and believe it or not, well, you would believe it, it's hard, because I think of how you created the Preston Townships to come together. So it was that kind of thing. We said, this is not a competition here. Like, we got to help each other if this thing is going to work. So what we said for ours is we want to work in partnership with people. It's not easy because we suspect each other of all kinds of things when anything happens. So for a minute you're saying, but later on it's like, okay, let's get back together and move together. So there's this juggling. So how we have it, for example, we had Upper Hammonds Plains. Curtis was on our board. Because of all kinds of other things. Right now, he's on our development committee. That's Upper Hammonds Plains. Kevin from United Way is on the Down the Marsh advisory group. He's a member of our advisory committee. Because they got experience and they've been doing things that we don't have. We haven't get. So what better way than to bring it in? Carol Ann, I think it's one meeting they've had when we created our development committee. She has the Beechville experience. She has Halifax Partners experience. She has this. Instead of being suspect or whatever, pull them in, put them. But it's not an easy process. But when you're starting now, Mr. Whiley, it's really, really important to try to get rid of those old way of doing things and do it a no way. It's going to be hard, but we can do it. We can work together.
Break the habit.
Another question.
Okay.
I was going to just offer some congratulations to Beechville and Upper Hammonds Plains, especially because I think we often see a lot of names dropped for a lot of organizations. And I think what both of those organizations have done have taken the action and actually produced results and showed how legitimate they are. And I think there's a lot to be learned. I've spoken with Curtis on several occasions, and I think there certainly is a lot to be learned from what they've done. So I congratulate them for that. Didn't realize I'd also be here tonight congratulating Lynn Jones on her dissertation, I guess I might call it. But very well said, Lynn. I think it's very inspiring. I have a couple of questions that I do want to ask. One of them, the first one is really piggybacking on something that Anthony said with regards to the land. Carol Ann, you mentioned earlier with regards to Beechville. I know that there's been some land that you've gotten back. I'm not sure if everybody's clear. I'm certainly not in terms of what specifically is the type of land that you got back? Because as Curtis, as you pointed out earlier, there's untitled, there's crown, there's so on and so forth. And I know you've worked with the municipality. in your journey. No, I mean I mean in terms of your group working with the municipality, the planners, and so on. And so I'm just curious as to what specific type of land that you acquired back, what the process was like, and maybe I can just mention a couple of other things quickly, and I'll just listen for the answer. I also wanted to know who were the biggest advocates that you found, and this question is to everybody on the panel, as far as the journey that you've taken, especially politically and community-wise. And I guess I'll say that this next one, it really isn't a point of criticism, but it's a question of curiosity. I'm wondering where the African Affairs Minister actually fits in this equation. What advocacy is being done on behalf of this issue by, I'm not talking about an associate deputy, I'm talking about the the Minister for African Affairs, and what involvement is his office having specifically in this process?
So the lands, so there's 12 parcels within the community of Beechville that are being transferred back. So we identified all those. All of those were historic lands, and they belonged, they were in, the city had them. So they weren't provincial lands, they were all HRM lands that we had transferred back. Those are 12, am I correct? So I have 2 Beechville people here I have to constantly just look at. The other boundaries as well are all HRM because we went through that process of identifying what they were, and we have to go through all those pieces of land, those 12 parcels, and identify what we were using them for. That's what we do. We have land for recreation, housing, all those things. The other piece, so those 12 parcels are all HRM. The phase 2 of Monroe subdivision is another parcel of land, and that's provincial, right? So that's a provincial land that was supposed to be developed, I think, probably in the 80s. And so the original Monroe subdivision was developed in the 60s, and there was supposed to be a second phase to that, and that's provincial land. So we're looking at having that transferred back. So if you don't use land, it gets transferred back to the government, and that's the thing that happens to us. We lose land, and land just erosion of land. So I think I answered all that. So we went through a parcel of just the community getting together and saying, here's what we want. And I have to say, I'm proud of the community for a lot of reasons, but that work done on all those parcels and the asset mapping and figuring out what those lands are used for was critical for us. So I think that's part of your question. The extension of the land, I said both 10 miles both width and breadth in the community. That process was the process that we went back and forth on. So those lands were HRM as well. Pardon? Oh, yes. And so Beechville, Lynn's reminded me of things I'm supposed to say. Thank you. So Beechville has its own strategy within HRM now. So the first thing that we did is get ourselves removed from the regional plan, because the regional plan designates growth areas. And that's what developers come and say, oh, this is a growth area, then there's land that I can purchase. And we get into a fight with a developer when HRM has designated that in a 20-year plan. Right. So I think we need to be really mindful, in Black communities, that we take ourselves out of growth plans once we decide what it is that we want to do. Because if we don't, we won't have the chance to develop our communities the way that we need to. We won't have that opportunity because developers come with money, and that's where the city gets its tax base. So we did that. We have a mission strategy, and that's now in the regional plan, right? So that we're no longer in there. And we have community action planning that comes once community has a plan. The city now has, as part of its policy, community action planning, where communities have access to all the departments within HRM to work on its behalf, right? So that's significant as well. And I don't think I answered the rest of your question, but some of our advocates, I said, as Danielle has mentioned, has been some planners. And I have to be honest, when they first come out, they took heat from the community because they kept talking about policy, right? Mm-hmm. And we're like, we know the policy, we're impacted by it. But folks took them on, and they called me the next day. I mean, folks tore them up, I'll be honest. And they called the next day and said, we messed up, didn't we? And I said, yeah, you did. But you're allowed back, but you gotta come back different, right? So, and the other piece of this, and the last thing I'll say, is what works is when community really leads their own process. If you have HRM come to your community, you have invited them. If you have the province come to the community, you have invited them, particularly on the process. And that worked well for us, and we suggest other folks do that as well.
And in terms for just the advocates, I would say that as well. The community really showed up, the planners. I'm not a person that gives accolades to counselors and stuff because they're paid to do their job. But I have to say, we had Richard Zarowski, and this man showed up and showed out. And I'm not gonna not give him his flowers because and that's why he's not in office today. Because he made a commitment to Beechville and even the community he resided in. He told them, no, we're where we need to be, here's where we need to focus. So I think that relationship building piece is so very important, but we also know that doesn't happen often. And I think our community was so surprised because it was a first experience for us.
We had a history of it.
Yeah.
This is being videotaped, so.
Yeah, it was a first for us to have a counselor show up in the way that he did, and he showed up. We didn't have to call him out. He showed up right after he was elected. So, I think that we took him, and we will welcome anybody. And as Carol Ann said, the planners also, it was that relationship piece, and they came back, even though I know some of them may not have wanted to, because it was rough, but they came, they stayed the course, and they're some of our biggest advocates. I think about a conversation where we weren't even present. The planners were advocating and looking for reparations for us, and we weren't even there, right? So it shows like that. But I would have to say our biggest advocates are always us, right? And we are the drivers, and when we kind of confuse that's when we go through problems. So as Carol Ann said, when we called folks out, no, you can have your agenda, here's what we're going with tonight. As Curtis said, for us, by us. With help. Yeah. With us. For us, by us, but with, bringing allies along with us.
Yeah, I share similar, feelings about HRM. So when we first started our zoning journey, we'll call it, it was definitely adversarial. There was a lot of talk about limits and what would be possible, but I have to give a shout out to Maureen Ryan, who is our planner for Upper Hammonds Plains, and we've built what I consider a friendship, and I do believe she is a true ally in our community. But it has taken a long time, and so, further to about the advocates politically, there are certainly been times when we've been advocated for, but it hasn't been without pressure from community. I don't feel like there's often, if we're not there pushing, I don't know how much advocating is happening. That's just at least my own personal opinion, but there's certainly been advocacy that has happened on our behalf. The community action plan is a very important piece that my friends from Beechville have raised, and so we've done that. We're following in the same kind of footsteps, and so folks understand we've done the zoning piece, and when our community action plan is finalized, we will submit that and begin this long range planning type of initiative similar to that of Beechville. So we're organically building a kind of a process for this, right? A kind of things to flow through and kind of places to go, a system, if you will. So that's exciting. And in terms of, other, support, political support, I don't think that we've had any, significant support in that regard. I think when I was first pitching this idea of community land trust to our government, it was a different government at the time. And we met with that leadership several times. was very involved with that organization, that being the Department of Municipal Affairs and Housing. So that's not the case now, but there are a lot more, players in the space now too. So I guess that's what happens when you grow a space, you can't meet with everyone. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, I think my answer is a little bit different just because we are not an established community land trust. We're not pursuing property in the same way. We're not kind of challenging the establishment in the same way. We're not asking for zoning changes, that type of thing. But I do think it's important to note, again, like what I see is this really quickly developing interest in community land trusts at all levels of government. Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation devoted all of their funding for a demonstrations initiative. It's a grant they put out every year. Typically, it's for all sorts of projects. Last year, it was just for community land trusts. At the provincial level, they've supported community land trusts through the Housing Commission. The city, it's in the 2022-2023 business plan. It's part of their priorities. But I guess the last thing I want to say is, we've done a lot of consultation just to see what people think. The most surprising bit of support / advocacy that we've seen is from the private development community. I kind of went in thinking a community land trust would be seen as competition, but in talking to them, they fully acknowledge this gap that exists in development capacity. They're telling us they're not going to pursue affordable housing development. It's not their priority. They can't make a business case for it. Somebody else is going to have to do it, and they'd be very happy to see community land trusts fill that void.
Okay, I'm just going to interject for a second. We're over our time, and I don't want to be disrespectful for those who do have to leave, but it's come to my attention that there's 3 more questions that people would like to ask, but I was going to ask for final wrap-ups from our panel, and I really appreciate that. So I have to ask the permission. Are we okay to go a little bit over for those 3 questions? If not, we can give the panel the final remarks.
Only if you ask the panel to keep the responses shorter.
Okay. They will agree. It's fine. That's fine. And if we need and have another conversation, we can oblige that as well. So, question here.
Oh, thank you. I have a part A and part B. Oh, okay. Okay, first of all, I'd like to know, has any Black community in Nova Scotia officially attained the title of Historic Black Township? And I believe that there are benefits to having that, such as Dresden, Ontario, is now a historic Black community, Black township. And developers can't come in and touch that land as a result. Have we attained that here, or any Black community attained that status?
In terms of securing lands, more broadly speaking, I think the short answer is no, not in my personal knowledge. Because again, it has to go, we have to work through where is the land going to go to. Is it going to go to an individual organization? Is it going to go to, and then there's a lot of other, considerations that have to be made. So I think the short answer is no, not to my knowledge. If you think about Upper Hammonds Plains, in particular, the community was granted 1,100 acres of land in 1855, right? So that did happen. So, it's not impossible, but as of anything recently, I'm not aware.
Okay, last question.
This question is for Mr. Adams, former MLA. I know that you're facilitating, but I'm sitting here listening, and it seems to me that this would have a profound positive effect on the watershed area, or in the Preston areas. Would it not?
I don't get the gist of your question. What's the profound impact?
A positive, profound positive impact. If
we had a land trust in the community?
Yes.
It wouldn't hurt, that's for sure.
So
not in my view anyway.
The land trust would if the Preston Township went for it, obviously would include the watershed area, would it not?
I do not include it. Watershed is pretty peculiar in its legislation.
Okay.
Anywheres, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so yes, we're going to wrap up with some final comments. Dr. Lynn, you're leaving? Okay. So we're going to wrap up with some final comments from the panel. And then I just want to make mention that there are some papers in the back that Kevin has provided for you guys, so please take those. And also there's an evaluation sheet that I would like you guys also to take. You can fill it out here. We have pens, or drop it back off at the library. That would be great as well. So I'll hand it over.
For me, I guess short and sweet. I am, because we are on Ubuntu, when we think about the Afrocentric worldview, we are all here for each other. So Truro, Beechville, Upper Hammonds, Plains, we may be at different parts in the journey, but we're here for everyone, because our ancestors, that's how we worked, right? Like, we are all interconnected, and the more we can help lift each other's work, the more powerful we'll be if we think about the collective, really, and also self-sustainability. That's where I think we should be focusing on too, like in our own lands and what that looks like for us. So keep pushing. It's not easy, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I'll leave I think, the time is now. The time is now for us to organize. The time is now for us to get serious and gather, each other and around this idea of community land trust. And, we are building a community. Just know that it's not something that you need to chart on your own. We're working through this together as a community. We're building this kind of community housing space. In particular for community land trust and for Black people and African Nova Scotians in particular. But I think, you can join this space, and there is support, and we want every community to be a part of this vision and to be a part of this coalition of community-led, development and community-led transformation.
Yeah, I'll just kind of follow up on that idea that the time is now. The time is now for a good number of reasons, and just to name a couple. The population of this province is growing fast, and the economic plan that the provincial government has issued suggests it's going to keep up at this rate for the foreseeable future. Their objective is to reach 2 million people, double the population of this province by 2060. That just means pressures on housing and land are only going to increase. And, it's about time to start taking stock of what our communities have available to them, what they want to have available to them, and what they want the future to look like. Because, the pressure's on. I think, Curtis's organization, Upper Hammonds Plains, is a very good example. If you look at the maps of development out there and just, the density of development at the doorstep and the pressure that's putting on the community to figure out how it's going to, protect its interests going forward, it's essential. So the time is now, but there is a good model, I think, to kind of work with. So, yeah.
Kevin, I couldn't say it better.
Just,
the fact the whole panel has said that. Now is the time.
It's the time. I just wanted to get it in so people can go. Is that we do have to have a conversation with funders in terms of, Lynn talked about it, we all talk about how we fund our communities. And I think, and that's why I emphasize plans. I know it drives people crazy, but if we all have our plans, we have a conversation with funders about what gets funded and how it gets funded, instead of that right now, we are jumping to the terms of funders. United Way, close your ears. I'm not really talking about you, but funders dictate what happens and what gets funded in community. And it should be the opposite, in terms of what community is. So I'm putting that out there as a strategy, as a town hall, as something that we have with funders that are related to the work that we do.
You have to find like-minded funders. And I believe they're out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of deep pockets in Nova Scotia, more than my lifetime. Yeah. That's why the time is now for this phase of democracy, if you will. And tonight has been an exercise in democracy. The opportunity to share how we can grow together with examples of growth. I sit here and look at the 4 communities that we talk about, Beechville, Truro, Upper Hammonds Plains. That's 3. And I see a renaissance, if you will. A new beginning, a new day, and that's good news for all of us. The question is, how does Land Trust fit the township of Preston? And is there a case to be made in Preston for land trust development? I think back a few years ago working with Lynn's nephew, we worked on a potential farm land trust for the area for black communities. Unfortunately, government didn't see the light of day and it died in the paper. Needless to say that I think the Annapolis Valley has the largest farm land trust in the province, if not in Eastern Canada. It's a large one, and it's a model for farm use and acquisition. But the same model applies what we're doing here with the land trust without farm. But we could always incorporate that where there still can be some farmlands in our black communities. So something to think about. As I thank you all for your splendid participation. Is Lynn gone? Okay. So maybe we can pause for a minute for her to come back and have a closing comment. That's the only fair thing to do. It's been a good audience too, actually. Very well behaved and well thought out with the questions, and that's all good.
There were 20 people joining virtually as well. Oh, wow.
20 online? Very good.
Maybe while we have some time, I'll just make a plug for a housing conference that we're hosting on Monday, which is virtual. If you want to look it up, Housing Symposium 2022 on Eventbrite. That's the registration page. We will be talking about community land trusts in a couple different forms. Curtis is going to be presenting an update on his work. We'll be presenting, asking some questions of the audience, also talking about Akuma's new development here, and a bunch of other kind of housing-related issues. So if you're interested, look it up online or get in touch with me.
Can I make a suggestion? Is it possible you could share that link with the library and hold it wherever you put it out on the distribution?
Good suggestion.
I think if we let Nicole Johnson use the internet and social media, we'll all know in a hurry.
I'll help her.
She does it well. Lynn Jones, we just had a wrap-up comments from everybody, and I said it wouldn't be fair to leave without you, so if you would, please.
Oh, that's so nice. And Sherry say, make it short. I'm never late. Anyway, I'm so happy that when they asked us to do this forum in the Preston, and I traveled a long way, I'm telling you, all the way from Truro to make sure that I was here, because that was really exciting. And so I think it's really good that we're just having this conversation, and I hope that whatever that we're doing, that when you do start your land trust, that you'll be in touch with us to look at some of the experiences that that we have. I just want, I say constantly, I want my community back. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be exactly the way it was before, but at least in our generation, so many things we've dropped the ball on. We really have. This is one thing that we can pick it up and actually see the finished product, like, you know, there's that vision. So that's it, and thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so on that note, I want to thank everybody again, and especially the facilitator, Dr. Wayne Adams. I want to thank Kevin personally. I want to thank Curtis personally. I want to thank Danielle, Carolyn, thank you. And Dr. Oh my gosh, Dr. Lynn Jones, yes. So working with these guys, I have to say this, working with these guys, yes, it was a lot of work, email and everything like that, but their willingness, their spirit of giving and sharing has been exceptional, and I thank you guys. So please reach out to them. If there's questions that you want me to ask and put forth, please do, but they're very approachable and reachable. And again, yeah, we can be the catalyst to and from the community to see this land trust come into development. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Nika, and thank you, Owen, very much.